Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this leadership episode of 30 Minutes to President's Club. My name is Armand Farouk, and I'm here with my co-host, Nick Sigelski. And folks, today we are live in studio with one of the greatest leadership guests we have had of all time. She is Eleanor Dorfman. She has led sales organizations and customer success organizations at Clever, at Segment, and most recently as the head of sales over at Retool. Those are three freaking awesome companies. So, Nick, why should people listen?
So Eleanor talks about how she measures whether or not AEs are doing a good job. And she does not just look at quota attainment. There's a number of different behaviors that she measures, and she measures them in a really interesting way to make sure that people aren't gaming the system, like artificially creating pipeline, etc. And so this helps her have a really, really transparent handle on holding people accountable in a way that makes her not a total and utter jerk. And then she also talks about one of the areas that I think sellers often point at leaders and saying, oh, you're being a jerk, which is how she approaches ROEs or rules of engagement. And so if you're a sales leader at a scaling, growing org, this was a really, really good listen.
Alrighty, Eleanor, welcome back to the show. We start every leadership show with your top 3 actionable takeaways. Let's get your 3.
Number one is that we all know quota attainment is the most important metric to track for your reps in terms of are they successful, how are they performing, but how they get there is usually just as important. And when you're trying to create a culture of transparency and accountability, tracking KPIs alongside quota attainment is just as important. For me personally, I like to track forecast accuracy, AE pipe gen, overall pipe gen, and close rate, because they create a balance with each other, almost like a system of checks and balances, where if you ding one, you get dinged on the other.
What's number 2?
In addition to creating transparency, you have to also make sure you have a culture of constant learning, and that creates people feeling safe being vulnerable and talking about wins as well as losses. To have a dedicated Slack channel for closed lost, especially competitive losses, where you can make sure you're learning as much as possible from every loss. And so to create one where you post a loss when you've lost and compete, why did you lose? What did you learn? What could you have done differently? And creating public support around that.
You know, I get 50 Slacks a day, and 48 are from Nick's closed lost deals. So what's number 3?
Number 3, in terms of how I think as a sales leader, it's important to run the business so that you can scale it effectively, is removing the word exception from your vocabulary. Exceptions might feel really good in the moment, but ultimately are the root of all evil. And so when you're creating ROEs, rules of engagement, make sure you set them fairly, and then make sure you adhere to them completely and you don't create exceptions, because that will ultimately breed a lack of trust.
All right, Eleanor, let's start with that first one, which is you're measuring AEs mostly on the North Star, which is quota attainment, but you're looking at a couple of other metrics as it relates to measuring the performance of an AE. And this stuff is important to you. You were saying that like promotions are based on how people are doing with these things. So the 4 that you listed beyond just quota were forecast accuracy, AE pipe gen, overall pipe gen, and close rate. What I'd like to hear from you is like, what are you actually looking at underneath forecast accuracy, and what does like a good metric for that actually look like? So maybe you can go through the metrics and explain what's behind it and what good looks like.
To zoom out a little bit, I think AEs are asked to do a ton all the time. They're asked to generate pipeline, they're asked to do renewals, they're asked to do, internal presentations,
Mhm.
they're asked to do syncs with their post-sales counterparts, they're asked to close deals and manage accounts. And a lot of AEs will always say, I'm doing too many things. How do I know what's most important? How do I know if I'm being measured? How do I basically have control over that? I find that it's really effective to create a lot of transparency and to be very clear. This is what we care about. This is how we're measuring it. This is why it matters. Here's how we're going to talk about it. For each of these, they're really important in terms of all of the ingredients that go into being a good AE and enabling you as a leader to run your business effectively.
Mhm.
An AE might not think forecast accuracy is that important, but as a leader, as a CRO, as a VP of sales, it's almost the most important thing, because you have to show you have control over your business
Mhm.
and you're managing up to your CEO, to your board. And so the forecast accuracy piece, I think, is really important, because AEs will submit a call every week and they might do it really quickly and not think about it. But if
Mhm.
they know that that's going to be tied to how they get promoted, how they're going to be performance managed, they're going to think a lot more critically before they submit a call and a best case every week.
Mhm.
And then you're going to feel a lot better using that information when you put together your call as a leader.
Mhm.
So this could vary business to business. I think we set ours within 20% of accuracy for the trailing 12 weeks of the quarter, because you are going to learn more as the quarter progresses. So, and we didn't want to say, hey, your first forecast is the only thing that matters. And so I think we did within 10 or 15% within your trailing 12 weeks, were you with closest to the pin.
Yeah.
And then you always celebrate at the end who was closest to the pin all quarter. And you
Yeah.
make that something that people are really proud to get right. and it gives you more control and the ability to run your business and have conviction delivering your forecast.
Could you talk about how this stuff actually gets woven into performance reviews or quarterly check ins or whatever it is? Because I understand you have these four metrics and then your manager reviews them weekly with the rep in the one on ones.
Yep.
Quarterly performance reviews come around. Are you looking at a week over week? This was your forecast accuracy every single week for the last 12 weeks. This was your quarterly win rate, things like that. How do you actually roll this up into a bigger picture feedback conversation with your reps?
Yeah, so we actually grounded it. And first, we built out what are our competencies? How does that map to levels? And then what are our performance ratings that ladder up to the entire company? And how does that map to the KPIs? And then we built a decision tree. Okay, did you hit X% of your quota? Yes. Okay, did you? What did you do on these four KPIs? If yes, okay, great. You'll did it successfully meets. Okay, great. Yes, you'll did it exceeds expectations. Oh, you did all four and you blew out your number. Okay, great. That's greatly exceeds expectations. Then a rep knows going into a performance cycle, they have the stats app, they know what their quota attainment was, and they can look at that and know what performance rating they're going to get. And they know that if they deliver on these four and against their revenue, that they will be eligible for a greatly exceeds expectations. And then we have promotion criteria. Hey, if you do this 2 quarters in a row, if you do this 3 quarters in a row, if you do this 4 quarters in a row, you'll be eligible to move to the next level. Then everyone is able to chart out their path. Here's how I get promoted. Here's how I get the performance rating I want. And here's how I'm tracking week over week so that I know if I'm performing against it and when you need to course correct.
Let's dig deep into the iron square metric by metric. What are you looking for a good win rate? And I'm also curious, what type of time horizon are you using to properly report win rates?
There's a lot of experimentation that goes into this. So when you first launch something like this, have an open mind because your initial hypothesis is probably going to be wrong. I think what we did is we set the win rate at stage 2 plus. We might have even done stage 3 plus to avoid a lot of tension over what's qualified or not. So
Yeah.
I think we actually did a stage 3 plus win rate. We looked at the historics for the business. We looked at what top quartile looks like and set something somewhere in between. Like we know this is what the business should do overall, and we know that this is excellent. So you at a minimum need to stay within the win rates of what we expect from the business. But then if you overperform that, that's something that can tie into getting an even better performance rating. So I believe we did stage 3 plus to avoid friction with what's qualified or not at stage 2. And then we tied it to the historical numbers from the business for when we've had successful quarters.
How did you avoid having reps not put anything into stage 3 unless they knew it was going to close because that was impacting their promotions?
You don't did an SE until you did something into stage 3. So you have to move something in stage 3 in order to get access to your sales engineering resources. And again, when this is all out in the open, when you're working on it every week with your manager, it's a lot harder to game the system. If you want to get access to an SE, if you want to run a POC, if you want to be able to deliver the resources you need to win the deal, you got to move things into stage 3.
How do you calculate win rates properly in sales?
This is a RevOps question because math always escapes me. And so I have no idea what goes into it behind the app, but we always end up arguing over some, and frequently the reps are right, and we'll go back and adjust them because it's tough. There's always going to be noise. There's going to be something that you inherited and ended up in your name and impacts your win rate. So you have to be flexible in terms of it'll drive a lot better Salesforce hygiene, though, I will say, if you know this is being tracked and it goes into your win rate. But there's going to be some stuff that muddies it up, and you have to be willing to go in and sort of recalculate.
I'll tell you the wrong way to do it is a lot of people will be like, great, all the opportunities that you've ever created divided by all the opportunities that you've ever won, or the other way around. And the problem is you need to account for some seasoning in your opportunities. So, for example, if you created an opportunity yesterday and you lost an opportunity yesterday, that doesn't mean you have a 0% win rate.
Yeah.
Right? It literally means that some of your opportunities have not even had the chance to be won.
And you need to think through how are you going to manage renewals? Like, what, does a renewal op go into it? Expansions ops should have a much higher win rate. So a lot of that goes into my amazing RevOps partners have always sort of thought through these things, but you have to do the pressure testing of how do we think about renewals? How do we think about expansions? Win rates on new business are always going to be lower. So thinking about how to set that win rate target and make sure that it takes all of that into account so that an AE feels comfortable losing something. Because a world-class win rate it's still somewhere between like 20 and 40%. Like it isn't 90%. You know, you're not shooting for 100%. You're going to lose more deals than you win.
So, one of the ways that you are incentivizing the right behaviors and incentivizing accuracy with these things is promotions are based off of the iron square, access to resources like the SE are based off of the iron square, and you're also making this stuff public so the whole team can see. I get the point of, okay, this is being reviewed with manager and rep in a one on one, but like where does this live publicly? Are you putting in a Slack channel? Is it just the app and then anyone can go into
Just
it?
in the app, and
Okay.
everyone's in there, and
Okay.
so it's all out in the open because none of this should be a secret. Like, everyone should be working together, everyone should be learning from each other. Competition is healthy. Your
Hmm.
best reps are always gonna wanna be number 1.
Yeah.
You wanna motivate that. Those people are amazing and do have an outsized impact on your business, and so part of that is creating an environment where it's okay to be competitive as long as you're collaborative and it's healthy. And one thing to date on the forecast accuracy and win rate in particular, create a healthy balance
Hmm.
because you can't just create fake pipeline and then call it if you know your win rate's going to be off. It's all
Hmm.
designed that they sort of counterbalance the other so that you don't create fake pipeline if you know you're not going to close it and you don't want to have a really low win rate because you have all this pipeline that isn't real. So it's not a perfect system by any means. I would argue it's like 70%
Yeah.
effective and we something that you need to keep fine tuning quarter over quarter, performance cycle over performance cycle. But the goal is that they balance each other so that you game the system as little as possible.
Yeah. The checks and balances are really important. You were talking to me on the prep call about the overall pipe gen metric as well as the AE pipe gen metric. So talk to me about why you have those separated and what goes into those two.
PG is everyone's responsibility, and AE source pipeline is incredibly important. But one of the biggest tensions that exists in any B2B SaaS business is the BDR and the AE, and is something qualified, and
Hmm.
who got the attribution, and should the attribution have gone to marketing,
Hmm.
or should it have gone to the BDR, or was it actually inbound because it was someone else from the company who requested the demo? When you spend all of your time litigating these things, that's time you're not spent selling.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to include both because AEs should be generating their own pipeline. It should be something like 25 or 30% is what I've always done of their pipeline should be from them. But they should also be motivated to partner really well with their BDR and to make their BDR successful. They should be motivated to partner really well with marketing, follow up on every event lead. Even if that event lead goes to marketing for attribution, that's still pipeline for them. And they should still be, you hear this all the time, the CEO of their own business. And part of that is you own your own pipeline generation, but also you own the rest of it because that's not just the BDR's number or marketing's number. That's your number too. And you need to feel like an owner of both.
You keep it simple. You tell them what metrics you're going to track. You don't make it a million metrics. You
No,
put it in one place and you put it in a place where every single person on the team is
yes.
constantly looking at it. When I was running the sales development team over at Carta, for SDRs, it was really simple. We had a 3-column dashboard: month, week, day. And it was just number of cold calls, connect rate, set rate, number of emails, open rate, reply rate, meetings booked from each channel. And you could literally see it stack ranked by rep.
Yeah.
And every single week in the Monday morning meeting, that's what we looked at. How many meetings did you book? How effective were your calls? How effective were your emails? And your team starts to get addicted to those things and optimizing those metrics when they see all of those things on the leaderboard every single day. Versus a lot of times, teams by quarter, by convenience, will change the metric that's important to them.
Hmm.
This quarter, it's stage 1 to stage 2. Next quarter, it's stage 3 to stage 4. Next quarter, it's average ACV. And the problem is, every single time you do that, it throws off your reps' rhythm for what is important.
Exactly. And to me, those short-term things, that's what SPFs are for.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
if you want to do some short-term behavior change, like, okay, we're going to really focus on stage 2 to stage 3 and getting something into a POC, do a quarter specific contest and a
Mhm.
SPIF for that. But no, give folks clarity and confidence that those 4 KPIs and quota attainment
Yeah.
aren't going to change because no matter what happens, those 4 are going to be important. And that's why those are the foundational ones that are tied to performance management and to promotions, and those don't change. But priorities of the business are going to change. And that's to me what SPIFs are for.
So, how do you teach your managers to problem solve off of this stuff? Let's say, for example, I see one rep who has a 15% win rate, and the next rep has a 25% win rate. How does a manager start to diagnose what's going on?
Honestly, I feel like they teach me about that too. And I also think by making it transparent, the reps can help themselves. So
Hmm.
they can look and they can see this person's win rate is a lot better than mine. And a really good rep is going to go listen to their DOMs and is going to go understand what they're doing it differently. They're going to go look through their Salesforce. They're going to talk to them. They're going to talk to their SE. They're going to look in their deal channels. They're
Hmm.
going to read their deal review notes and they're going to see, okay, these are some areas where I can improve. And then otherwise, it does create a good playbook for the managers to say, hey, This is where you're underperforming relative to your peers. Let's talk about why. Like,
Mhm.
are you qualifying deals that shouldn't be qualified? Are you stuck with a low level champion because you've never gotten to the EB? Are you working on something that isn't that important to the company and spinning cycles on it? Are you trying to close a deal for enterprise that should definitely be a self service deal? And rather than qualifying it out early, are you
Mhm.
spending an entire 3-month POC and cycle on it in order to lose to the self service business, which is often what it is,
Yeah.
at least in my experience in the companies I've been at. But it creates areas for the managers to focus and
Mhm.
to diagnose where the issues are too. Again, on those 4 core KPIs that never change.
Armand, how would you do this as a VP of sales as it relates to teaching your managers how to diagnose problems?
I want to echo what Eleanor said around the best teams teach the reps how to self-diagnose issues, and
Yep.
then the managers give sense checks.
Yep.
Mhm.
So I'll go back to the
Exactly.
SDR example, and then I'll give you an AE example because SDR is a little bit simpler. I'm coaching this awesome SDR named McKenna right now. She's one of my advisory clients,
Mhm.
and her meetings went down from 4 to 2 last week. If this was 8 weeks ago when we first started working together, she would have said, "Why'd my meetings go down?"
Mhm.
I don't know. She came to the meeting. She's like, "Okay, my emails were constant, my open rate was constant, my reply rate was constant. I got 2 meetings from emails. I didn't get any meetings from cold calls. Okay, my cold calls were constant. And so it's either my connect rate or my set rate." She looked at both of them. She's like, "I have an issue with my connect rate." I'm like, "Awesome. Let's talk about ways to boost your connect rate." To me, that's an awesome rep doing self-diagnosis.
Mhm.
And so what you do is you don't want to get into metrics overload,
Yep.
but you want to teach people sort of one layer down the decision tree. So for example, if I'm taking revenue, one layer down the decision tree is, do you have enough pipeline?
Mhm.
Are you winning that pipeline? And then you have, how big are the average deals and
Yep.
time to close, things
Yeah.
like that, right? So you can usually deduce most of the metrics from one of those four. From there, let's say win rates are an issue. You really want to understand where the win rates are starting to fall apart. And that's when you start to look at things like stage by stage conversion. Personally, that is as far as I like to go on the metrics side. Like anything more like doing all these crazy close loss analysis by rep, I find it gets really muddy. From that point on, that's when I'm like actually coaching the calls,
Yeah.
or I'm asking the managers go dig in on their last 5 first discovery calls because they have a stage 1 to stage 2 issue. And that's how you actually like unpack from metrics quantitative to the qualitative stuff you should be coaching, in my experience.
The other piece of what I really liked about the McKenna example is it's very easy in sales to say, well, it's not my fault. Like, no one's picking up cold calls right now. Or, this exogenous thing is happening. Like, it can feel so much like everything happens to you. Where when you create an environment like that, you can help people realize how much is in their control
Mhm.
and to help them take control over it. And so they move from their mindset of, I'm going to blame everyone around me, to I'm actually in control of my own destiny. And you're better when you feel in control, and giving them people that visibility, the tools to self diagnose, the tools to get better, the visibility to see how it gets better is such a virtuous cycle of creating a culture of ownership
Yeah.
and of not blaming things around you. And that creates better, healthier reps as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to be focusing on your locus of control and problem solving if you are massively distracted over litigating who gets credit for an inbound lead that an AE was prospecting and an SDR was also a quarter ago. You have a really, really specific approach to rules of engagement, also called ROEs. Talk to me about what that is.
It goes back to what I was saying earlier about how there is a ton that's outside of your control. You're going to lose more than you win. It's a really hard job. You're told no a lot. Your success depends on a lot of other people. You win as a team, you lose as a team. Half of your salary is at risk all the time.
Mhm.
Every 90 days, the clock resets and suddenly you're back to zero. Like, emotionally managing all of that is really hard.
Mhm.
And a key part of showing up every day as a rep and doing your best work is trusting your leadership and trusting that your leadership will be fair
Mhm.
and trusting that you understand how they make decisions, trusting that they have your back, but they don't have someone else's back more than they have your back. Like,
Yeah.
all of that really matters in order to wake up every morning and start generating pipeline and trying to close deals. And so to me, consistency in leadership and decision making is a key part of that. And it's a lot harder than it sounds. Very specifically, and everyone has to learn this the hard way. Like, I don't think there's any way to get into sales leadership and not make a ton of mistakes around this. But when you set rules of engagement at the
Mhm.
beginning of the year or in planning, you set them with RevOps, you set them with all of the leadership's teams, you all, hold hands and agree on them. I believe in no exceptions. No matter how tempting it is or how complicated it is or how emotional it is, you follow the rules of engagement.
So let's talk about the common buckets of ROEs. Looking at it, I see them falling into three different categories. The first is who is allowed to work what. That includes regional territories, employee counts, segment lines, things like that. Number two is what happens when something changes hands.
Mm.
So you have territories changing hands, opportunity holdovers, SDR to AE handoffs, AE to AM handoffs, etc. And then the last bucket that I had is a little bit more associated with the world of like the AE to SDR stuff in terms of like what's qualified, what considers a point in the round robin versus not. What do you do if an AE gets a demo request that no shows? Do they get a credit back? So I know those aren't the perfect buckets, but why don't we start with the first one? When you think about who is allowed to work what accounts, what are some of the baseline rules you need to set as a sales leader?
I think there's a few, gosh, even that one bucket is so many different buckets because the ROEs are so messy. So again, it depends on the size and nature of your business.
Mhm.
But as you move beyond your first 2 or 3 reps, you'll probably start to draw some segmentation lines. These reps will work 0 to 100 employees. These reps will work 100 to 1,000. These reps will work 1,000 plus.
Mhm.
Those will change year over year, again, as your business moves up market and expands. So that's one. Again, as you move internationally, suddenly it's going to be okay, this is where is this headquartered?
Mm.
And then there's complexities around if it's headquartered here, but everyone's over here, but the buying node is over here. You have to have an objective way to set that. So I think the two most important ones are segment lines.
Mhm.
And then what are you going to use as your objective criteria for who can work it and where it is? We use shipping HQ in
Mhm.
Salesforce. If it's different in LinkedIn, if it's different on their S1, if it's different on Wikipedia, we don't care. Even if it's inaccurate, it has to be consistent, or else people are going to spend all of their time putting together a presentation on
Mm.
why it should move into a different territory. Shipping HQ, LinkedIn, you use that every time. You know it's not going to be accurate all the time,
Yeah.
but it's going to be the same.
You're focused on consistency
Yeah,
more than accuracy 100% of the time. You'd rather be consistent 100% of the time than accurate 100% of the time.
exactly.
How often are you revisiting these data refreshes? Is it annually, quarterly,
Oh, the
otherwise?
data's refreshed. It depends where your sources are.
Yeah.
But I think we try and keep the data refreshed constantly. So, and it matters at the moment of time. So when
Mhm.
the demo is request, what does the data say on that
Mhm.
day? So you have to say on this day, this is the source of the data, but you always keep your data up to date.
So this would drive me crazy, extremely triggering. When I was at Carta, the way that we would price was based on the number of investors you had on your cap table, which would include everyone who invested in your company and all of the employees who also held options. The closest thing to reporting on that is your employee count.
Yep.
But technically, there can be a difference. So, for example, if you have like 30 employees, you might actually have like 60 stakeholders on your cap table
Yep.
because people have left the company, exercised their
Or
options, you
there's
have
companies
investors.
where it's not FTEs, they have a ton of contractors. Do you
Mhm.
count the dashers for DoorDash? Like, what do you
Exactly.
use as your data source for that?
So my question for you is we had so many disputes because the SMB territory line at Carter was tiny. It was 1 to 25 employees.
Oh.
But if someone had 30 stakeholders, you could make a protest that that should be a mid-market deal. So you'd get a 20 employee count with 31 investors and you'd have to pass it up to the next segment. And so there were probably 4, 5, 6 deals being passed every single day. And it's not only bad from a customer experience, it also just creates a ton of infighting. So you had a similar type of issue, I think, at Segment and probably at Retool.
Well, I think you can have that issue anywhere. It's just exacerbated at different levels. But I mean, I've definitely had that issue all the time. And then what do you happen if the employee count changes mid deal cycle? Do you have
Yeah.
to pass it up? And so you have to set rules around all of that.
Mhm.
But this is where working with RevOps and poking holes from the beginning and doing a lot of role playing. Okay, if X, Y, and Z happens, what will we do? If X, Y, and Z happens, what do we do? We include a lot of examples in our ROE. So we can say,
Yeah.
Mm.
before you even come to us with something, is the example in the ROE. So our ROEs in Confluence are very long and very detailed and very scenario oriented because you can sort of game out what the issues are going to be.
Yeah.
And again, if what you're optimizing for is consistency versus, I mean, accuracy is obviously
Of
very
course.
important,
Right.
but I actually would argue consistency is more important because you want to create something that's objective, transparent, and
Mhm.
feels fair.
Mhm.
Because if it feels fair, you know they're going to break your way the same number of times they're going to break against you.
Mm.
And I think if you aren't consistent, it might break against you more often than not. That's going to make someone really unhappy and then be really demotivating. And so if the goal is to keep everyone motivated, it needs to be fair. You need to do what you say you're going to do, and it needs to be consistent.
Could you give an example rule for how you would draw segment lines? And if you find that the actual pricing metric is really different from the segment lines, like what's the rule around that?
For us, the examples are it's whatever it is when you get the deal and when you qualify it. And
Mhm.
so if it's a 0 to 100 employees and it's 99 employees,
Mhm.
when it comes inbound, it goes to stage two, you're working it, it stays with you even if they grow to 200 or 300 employees during the course of the deal. Once it's closed lost, and again, this is where you have to have accountability and the manager making sure it's real and you're not just holding on to it.
Mhm.
Once it's closed lost, it'll then move to mid market. When it goes back into the account pool, or moves into, refresh territories, it'll move to mid-market. But once you've qualified it, it's yours till it's close won or close lost.
And what do you do when the rep has the magically shrinking territory?
You just deal with it. It always happens. There's no 100%. You're gonna end up
Mhm.
with splits. It's why you try and cover as much as you can with ROEs. You're gonna end up in messy situations, so you try and cover as much as you can, and you make it very clear that you won't do exceptions. When you end up in a situation where it's not covered by the ROEs, you gotta work from first principles and try and figure out the right way to do it. But if people know that 90% of the time it'll be covered by the ROEs and that you will not make an exception no matter what, they'll also stop coming to you and asking for an exception because
Mhm.
they know that the answer will be no.
Yeah.
And then you'll reduce the time people spend on putting together their business case for why it should stay with one team versus the other. And they'll spend that time outbounding and selling. And you'll get people. What I love is I feel like the team at Retool got so accustomed to the ROEs and what they were that they would self report. And they would say, hey, this thing moved into my name. I don't think it should have, rather than have a big argument in 2 months. Should we move it to the right person now?
As it relates to who can work what, Armand, you led the sales team at Pave for a long time. Eleanor, you've led a number of different sales organizations. Can you just both share maybe how you like where the what lines you drew from a territory perspective, both in terms of like the segment lines? It sounds like for you it might have been employee count, as well as like geos, just so people can understand this. Because I've heard so many different ways of like people assigning territories alphabetically instead of geographically, or like I had attorney count when I was selling to law firms. It was based on the number of attorneys, and there were lots of different variables in there. So I think it would be good for folks just to hear like how you two chose to draw those lines in your leadership positions.
Mine has always been employee count, and then that can change because you might resegment year over year, and then you figure out holdovers and how to manage that.
Hmm.
I've done geos internationally. We've done some geos domestically. I find geos are more relevant internationally than they are in the US, especially with the way people buy today.
Yeah.
And then we used to do full account pool and round robin. And again, this changes as the sales org matures. But then we actually moved into a named account model. So
Hmm.
you have your territory at the beginning of the year, your named accounts. No matter what happens,
Hmm.
even if they move their HQ, if they move
Hmm.
their employee line, those are your accounts till the end of the year.
Hmm.
And then we'll still distribute the inbound via round robin. Those are the ones where if you close lost and they can move to a different territory, but your territory in the beginning of the year is your territory.
Hmm.
And that also plays into we do what we say we're going to do. We're going
Hmm.
to give you these accounts and we're not going to thrash you mid year. Those are going to be your accounts till the end of the year. And you know that so you can build out a plan and work them.
Very similar. My goal is to minimize handoffs
Yep.
between reps and not create a jarring experience for the customer.
Hmm.
And so what that meant is we would establish what accounts were commercial, mid-market, and enterprise based on employee count.
Hmm.
So 1 to 250 was commercial, 250 to 1,000 was mid-market, 1,000 plus was enterprise, and then eventually we had strategic. Because we didn't do much SMB selling, even for our commercial reps, we were able to carve out books where we got most of the TAM covered,
Interesting.
and that was your book for the year. And then there was a pool of accounts that were named and stamped commercial, where mid-market reps literally could not pick them up.
Yep.
And same thing with enterprise. And then we would continuously refresh the data, but we wouldn't continuously restamp the accounts so you didn't have this constant moving across segments. It wasn't perfect, but my goal was so that when we carve territories with a plan, if a company grew by 30 employees over 2 quarters, to me, like there's not such a radical difference that you should take that from one rep and put it in another rep's hands.
How did the two of you approach holdover periods? So the year ends. I now have a new book. Territories are changing, but I've got a really big deal. I've worked for a long time. Like it's just on the cusp. We're in active red lines, maybe. Like, what was your approach, Eleanor?
I have another rule that I use for ROEs and for territory setting and for anything is your internal processes should never impact the customer experience.
Hmm.
And so when you're trying to make a decision about something or how do we want to run this, like our internal problems are not their problems. So
Hmm.
our internal processes I have to use it a lot with finance when they're like, well, we need X, Y, and Z from the customer. And I'm like,
Yeah.
our internal processes
Yeah.
should never impact the customer experience. For holdouts, we had the same rule from the beginning. When territories change over,
Mhm.
anything you have that's stage 2+, you get to hold out for an extra quarter.
Yeah.
And that's been our holdout rules for everything.
How about you?
It was open opportunities,
Mhm.
but there was a limit on how many you could have. That should honestly be countered by managers should be doing better inspection, but there's a little bit of a conflict of interest.
Because manager wants their rep to have the deal, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's say, for example, reps know at the beginning of the year the territories are going to be carved.
Mhm.
What are they going to do? I had a meeting with the prospect.
Yeah.
I'm going to create the opportunity, maybe move it to stage 2,
But
whatever
then
it is.
if they know they're being measured on their win rate,
Mm.
they're not going to want to keep something that might be not a real deal
go.
that they
Mhm.
can't close in the next 3 months, because then it'll move out of their name and it'll
Right.
be in their win rate. So
Yeah.
a lot of it is how do you balance that behavior too? Because they'll just want to move everything into stage 2 and keep it, but actually it doesn't make any sense if it'll make their artificially depress their win rate.
The goal is to never disrupt pipeline.
Yep.
If something's actually in pipeline,
Mhm.
I want a rep to see that through.
100%.
That said,
I also want to pay the person who did the work.
correct.
Like if you did the work, you should be the one who gets paid.
Exactly. Where it starts to get messy is when you try to move territories, to change your business strategy, to change your sales strategy, to give new reps a shot. And 90% of the best accounts are in holdover.
Yeah.
And so it's like the caste system
Yeah.
where like all of the new reps have to work their way up through the worst possible books
Mhm.
because you have the most generous holdover period. I find that you have to be fair and inspect the heck out of what's really in pipeline
Yeah.
and limit the number of holdovers a rep can have. And if someone has like 40 or 50 holdovers, as the VP of sales, you go in and you dig in on those things to
Yeah.
make sure the manager isn't messing around. Alrighty, Eleanor, we talked about a lot of good habits when it comes to metrics, ROEs, and all these other things. I think I know where you're going to go with this, but we have to talk about a bad habit. So what is one bad habit?
Oh, there's so many. I mean,
Well, let me finish. What is one bad habit that every leader should break so that all teams get better?
making an exception is really tempting, and you're still going to do it even if you say that you never will. So just try and do it as little as possible and put no exceptions on a post-it on your calendar.
Mhm.
Like put it on your desktop. Make sure you're looking at it every day, because when someone whose success you care deeply about comes to you with an extraordinarily rational ask, every part of you will want to say yes, and it'll feel really good in the moment, and then it'll feel really bad a week or two later because it'll always come back and haunt you.
Mm.
Holding true to that, if it's in the ROE, we have to honor the ROE.
Amazing show, Eleanor. Everyone hang on for a 60-second recap coming up soon. Alrighty, folks, it's time for a 2x2 recap from this episode with Eleanor Dorfman. Nick, what do you have for your 2?
So my first one is, if you are looking to make short-term behavior changes, that is what a SPF is for. Long-term behavior changes come from your iron square of what you measure folks against. So that's my first one. The second one was Eleanor's approach to holdovers on accounts, where if territories change but you have an open opportunity. Her rule is that you get one additional quarter to close that deal if it is past stage 2. Beyond that, there are zero, and I mean zero exceptions. The way that she thinks about the no exceptions rule is sometimes it's going to go your way as an AE, sometimes it won't, but she would rather be consistent than try to tweak every deal and have people put together business cases and litigate exceptions.
Number 3, the iron square for rep productivity.
Mhm.
You have win rate, AE source pipeline generation overall, and forecast accuracy. And then in the center, you have the North Star, which is quota attainment. And then lastly, number 4, your internal nonsensical processes should not impact the customer experience. If you have a segment line that is off by one employee, make sure that there's enough buffer built
Mhm.
into your territories and your ROEs so you're not constantly passing deals and making your customers feel the exchange of reps deals between different hands. Alrighty, Nick, how can people help us out?
So a lot of what Eleanor talks about in her ROEs is stage-based. And we sat down with Mark Cosaglo and we documented his 5-step sales process and the different stages that go into this. If you don't have really, really consistent and clear definitions of what constitutes stage 2 versus stage 3 versus stage 4, you are going to run into a lot of headache and hassle. And so we've got a link in the show notes on this one to go check out that newsletter we did with Mark. Give it a read. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week on 30 Minutes to President's Club.